There's a pattern in history that has destroyed three major empires through debt. And right now, in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern, stage by stage, trillion by trillion, almost like we're reading from a script written in bankruptcy and collapse. In the 1500s, Spain controlled the richest silver mines in history, more wealth than any nation had ever possessed. And within 150 years, they had defaulted on their debt 4 times. The empire that owned half the world's silver couldn't pay its bills. In the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire ruled from Vienna to Yemen, 600 years old. Vast territories, millions of subjects. And by 1875, they were bankrupt. European creditors took control of Ottoman finances. The empire became a debt colony, and within 50 years, it ceased to exist. In 1990, Japan was the second largest economy on Earth. They were buying Rockefeller Center and Hollywood studios. Everyone predicted Japan would overtake America. And then their debt bubble burst. 35 years later, they still haven't recovered. Debt to GDP is 264%. An entire generation lost to stagnation. 3 empires, 3 complete debt spirals, 3 moments when borrowing for prosperity delivered bankruptcy and collapse. And here's what should terrify you. The United States has more debt than all 3 of these empires combined at their peaks. 36 trillion and climbing. Interest payments alone are now $1.1 trillion per year, more than we spend on defense. And we're still borrowing $2 trillion more every year just to keep the machine running. We're not heading toward the debt spiral. We're in stage 5 of 7. And history says stage 6 and 7 come fast. This is the story of how empires borrow themselves to death, why they always think they can manage it, and why the math says we're next. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what a debt-death spiral actually is, not in economic theory, in practice. When a nation can't escape, a debt-death spiral doesn't start with crisis. It starts with success, with growth, with the reasonable belief that borrowing for investment will pay off, build infrastructure, fund military expansion, invest in the future. And for a while it works. The borrowed money creates growth. The growth generates tax revenue. The revenue pays the debt. It's sustainable until it's not, because growth doesn't continue forever. And when growth slows, when the investments don't pay off as expected, the debt is still there. The interest payments are still due. And governments face a choice: cut spending to match revenue, raise taxes to pay the debt, or borrow more to cover the shortfall. Cutting spending means recession. Raising taxes means political suicide, so they borrow more. And this is where the spiral begins, because when you borrow to pay previous debt, you're not investing anymore. You're not building anything. You're just postponing the crisis. And the debt grows faster than the economy, which means interest payments take a larger share of the budget, which means less money for everything else, which means more borrowing, until the day when lenders realize you can't pay. And when that confidence breaks, when bond markets refuse to lend anymore, you have only 2 options. Default, or inflate the currency to pay the debt in worthless money. Both options destroy the economy. Both options end the empire. That's not theoretical. That's what happened to Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan 3 times, the exact same way. Let's start with the first great debt spiral, Spain. 1500 to 1650, this is the original blueprint. In 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas for Spain. And over the next 50 years, Spanish conquistadors conquered the Aztec and Inca empires. They seized control of the richest gold and silver mines ever discovered. The Potosi silver mine in Bolivia alone produced 45,000 tons of silver over 2 centuries. Spain minted this silver into coins and became the wealthiest nation on earth. In the early 1500s, Spain was a superpower. King Charles V ruled Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and all of Spanish America. The sun never set on his territories. And all of this was expensive, very expensive. This is stage 1 of the debt-death spiral, borrow for expansion. Charles V was constantly at war. Against France, against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant rebels in Germany, wars on multiple fronts, multiple continents, all requiring massive armies, ships, weapons, and supplies. And Charles funded it all with debt. He borrowed from German bankers, from Italian bankers, from anyone who would lend, because he had collateral, the silver from the Americas. Lenders believed Spain could always pay because the silver kept flowing. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain borrowed constantly, and the debt grew. But so did the empire, so it seemed manageable, until it wasn't. This is stage 2. Growth slows, but spending doesn't. By the mid-1500s, Spain's military campaigns were costing more than the silver revenues could cover. King Philip II, Charles' son, inherited the throne in 1556, and he inherited 36 million ducats in debt. That's about $3 billion in today's money. Enormous for the time. Philip kept spending. He fought the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. He tried to conquer England with the Spanish Armada. He fought a brutal 80-year war trying to keep the Netherlands under control. And all of it was funded with borrowed money. By 1557, just 1 year into his reign, Philip couldn't pay. Tax revenues were 7 million ducats per year, but debt service was 5 million. Interest alone consumed 70% of government revenue. September 1557, Philip II declared bankruptcy. Spain defaulted on its debts. He suspended all debt payments. Unilaterally restructured the loans, converted them to long-term bonds at lower interest. The bankers had no choice, accept the restructuring or get nothing. This is stage 3, borrow to pay previous debt. Ponzi phase begins. But here's the thing about sovereign defaults. They don't solve the problem. They just reset the clock. Philip still needed to fund his wars, so after the default, he started borrowing again, and lenders, incredibly, lent to him again. Why? Because Spain still had the silver mines. And lenders convinced themselves that this time would be different. It wasn't. 1560, Philip defaulted again. Just 3 years later, 1575, third default. 1596, fourth default. 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. Each time, Philip promised reforms. Each time he went right back to borrowing and spending. And each time, the debt spiral got worse. This is stage 4. Interest becomes unsustainable, math breaks. By the end of Philip's reign in 1598, debt service consumed 100% of revenue. Every ducat that came in went straight to creditors. Nothing left for government operations, military, or anything else. The only way to function was to borrow more, but lenders were charging 18-20% interest because Spain was a terrible credit risk. And when your interest payments exceed your revenue, you're mathematically insolvent. You're a zombie empire. Walking Dead. Stage 5. Lenders lose confidence, credit freeze. By the early 1600s, lenders were refusing to lend to Spain, or charging interest rates so high that borrowing made the problem worse. Spain tried debasing the currency. They mixed copper into silver coins. A coin that should be pure silver was now 50% copper. This is inflation by fraud, and it destroyed trust in Spanish currency. Prices exploded. What cost 1 coin in 1600 cost 10 coins by 1650. The economy seized up. Trade collapsed. Businesses failed. And the silver from the Americas? It all flowed out of Spain immediately to pay for imports. Spain produced almost nothing domestically. They'd become dependent on imports from France, England, the Netherlands, countries that were actually building industries while Spain just extracted and spent. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal, which had been united under the Spanish crown. By 1648, they lost the Netherlands in the Treaty of Westphalia, ending 80 years of war with nothing to show for it. By 1650, Spain was a second-rate power, broke, diminished, irrelevant. Stage 6, default, austerity, or hyperinflation. Spain chose slow decline through inflation and repeated defaults. They never fully collapsed, but they never recovered either. The empire that had owned half the world's wealth became a cautionary tale. The lesson of Spain: having unlimited resources doesn't save you if your spending exceeds revenue. The silver flowed in and flowed right back out to creditors, and the debt spiral destroyed the greatest empire of its age. But Spain was centuries ago. Surely modern governments learned that lesson. The Ottoman Empire proved they didn't. Let's jump forward 250 years. The Ottoman Empire, 1850 to 1923. In 1850, the Ottoman Empire was still vast, stretching from the Balkans to Arabia. From North Africa to Mesopotamia, they'd ruled for over 500 years. But the empire was already declining. They'd lost wars to Russia, lost territory in Europe, and they were desperately trying to modernize. Modernization costs money. Stage 1, borrow for growth and military. In the 1850s, the Ottoman government began borrowing from European banks, French, British, German. The loans were used to modernize the military, build railroads, telegraph lines, ports, all the infrastructure of a modern state. The Ottoman leaders believed modernization would restore the empire's power, and foreign lenders believed the Ottoman Empire was too big to fail. It was a Christian empire's interest to keep the Ottomans solvent as a buffer against Russia. So European governments encouraged lending. The first Ottoman foreign loan was in 1854, £3 million sterling at 6% interest to finance the Crimean War. The Ottomans repaid it, so lenders issued more loans. By 1875, the Ottoman Empire had borrowed £200 million sterling. That's about $30 billion in today's money. For an empire with limited industrial capacity and declining tax revenues, it was unsustainable. Stage 2. Growth slows, but spending doesn't. The modernization didn't generate the economic growth the Ottomans expected. The railroads were built, but they didn't create industry. The military was modernized, but they still lost wars. And the borrowed money? Much of it was stolen by corrupt officials or wasted on palace luxuries. Sultan Abdulaziz built massive palaces while the treasury was empty, Meanwhile, the empire was shrinking. They lost territory in the Balkans, lost control of Egypt. Tax revenues were falling while debt payments were rising. By 1873, the Ottoman government was spending 50% of revenue on debt service. Half of everything they collected went to European creditors. Stage 3, borrow to pay previous debt. By the early 1870s, the Ottomans were borrowing new loans just to pay interest on old loans. Classic Ponzi scheme. And lenders knew it, but they kept lending because they believed European governments would bail out the Ottomans to prevent Russian expansion. October 1875, the Ottoman Empire declared bankruptcy. They couldn't make debt payments, default. This is stage 4. Interest unsustainable, math breaks. But unlike Spain, the Ottoman default wasn't a restructuring they controlled. European creditors took control. In 1881, the Ottoman Empire signed the Decree of Muharrem. This established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. European creditors now directly controlled Ottoman finances. They took over tax collection in certain provinces. They controlled customs revenues. They dictated how money was spent. The Ottoman Empire had become a debt colony, technically still sovereign, but economically controlled by foreign creditors. Stage 5. Lenders lose confidence, foreign control. For the next 30 years, European creditors extracted wealth from Ottoman territories. The Ottoman government couldn't borrow anymore. They couldn't invest. They could barely pay for basic government operations. And without money, they couldn't maintain control. Provinces started breaking away. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania all became independent. And the European powers started carving up Ottoman territory. France took control of Lebanon. Britain took Egypt and Cyprus. Italy took Libya. The empire was being dismembered by its creditors. World War I was the final blow. The Ottomans sided with Germany. They lost. And the empire was formally dissolved in 1923 by the Treaty of Lausanne. Stage 6 and 7, default leads to collapse and dissolution. Now let's look at the most recent example. Japan, 1990 to present. This one's important because Japan is still in the spiral, right now. In 1980s, Japan was unstoppable. Their economy grew 10% per year. Japanese companies were buying American landmarks. Sony bought Columbia Pictures. Mitsubishi bought Rockefeller Center. Japanese cars and electronics dominated global markets. And everyone predicted Japan would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Then the bubble burst. Stage 1. Borrow for growth, but it's a bubble. In the 1980s, Japanese real estate and stock prices exploded. The Imperial Palace grounds in Tokyo were theoretically worth more than all real estate in California. The Nikkei stock index went from 7,000 in 1980 to 38,915 in December 1989. This wasn't based on fundamentals. It was speculation fueled by cheap credit. Banks lent recklessly. Corporations borrowed massively. Everyone believed prices only go up. They were wrong. Stage 3. Borrow to pay for crisis response. Throughout the 1990s, Japan tried to spend its way out of stagnation. Every time the economy slowed, the government announced a new stimulus. More borrowing. More debt. And it didn't work. Why? Because the fundamental problem, the bad debts in the banking system, was never fixed. Zombie companies, businesses that were insolvent but kept alive by cheap loans, clogged the economy. They didn't invest, didn't hire, didn't grow. They just existed, draining resources that could have gone to productive firms. By 2000, Japan's debt was 128% of GDP. By 2010, 200%. Today, 2025, it's 264% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. Stage 4. Interest payments become unsustainable except for one thing. Japan found a cheat code, or so it seems. The Bank of Japan, the central bank, buys most of the government debt. This is called debt monetization. The government issues bonds. The central bank buys them with printed money. This keeps interest rates near zero. So even though Japan has 264% debt to GDP, they pay less than 2% of GDP in interest, because the interest rate is artificially suppressed. But this only works as long as inflation stays low and people trust the currency. If inflation appears, interest rates have to rise. And if interest rates rise to even 2%, Japan's interest payments would consume 5% of GDP. At 5%, they'd consume 13% of GDP. The budget would be impossible. Stage 5. Trapped in the spiral, can't escape. This is where Japan is right now. They can't raise interest rates without blowing up the budget. But they can't keep them at zero forever without destroying the currency. They can't cut spending because the population is aging and social security costs are exploding. And they can't grow their way out because the population is shrinking. Japan's population peaked in 2008 at 128 million. Today it's at 123 million. By 2050, it'll be under 100 million. Fewer workers, fewer taxpayers. More retirees demanding benefits. The math doesn't work. Japan is in a debt trap, and they've been there for 35 years. They're not collapsing like Spain or the Ottomans. They're stagnating, slowly dying. Wages haven't increased since 1990. An entire generation has lived their entire working lives in stagnation. Young people can't afford homes, can't start families. Birth rate is 1.3, far below replacement. The country is dying in slow motion. Stage 6 and 7. Japan hasn't hit these yet. They're stuck in stage 5. But the pattern says stage 6 is coming. Either default, impossible for Japan, they borrow in their own currency, or hyperinflation, when the currency finally breaks from too much printing, or lost decades that become a lost century. The lesson of Japan: modern monetary tricks can postpone the debt spiral, but they can't stop it. Japan has bought time, 35 years of it, but the debt still exists. The demographics still deteriorate, and the math is still impossible. 3 empires, 3 debt spirals: Spain, Ottoman Empire, Japan. Different centuries, different circumstances, but the exact same 7-stage pattern. Let's break it down, because once you see it, you'll understand why the United States is in stage 5 right now. Stage 1, borrow for productive investment or expansion. Every debt spiral begins with reasonable borrowing. Spain borrowed to fund empire and wars. The Ottomans borrowed to modernize. Japan borrowed to recover from a bubble. And at first, it seems smart. Use other people's money to grow. It works. Until stage 2. Growth slows, but spending doesn't stop. Spain's wars stopped generating profit. The Ottomans' modernization didn't create growth. Japan's stimulus didn't restart the economy. But in all 3 cases, the spending continued, because politically, it's impossible to cut spending. And economically, cutting spending during slow growth makes things worse, so they kept spending. Check. Stage 3. Borrow to pay previous debt, Ponzi phase. This is the critical stage. When you're borrowing not to invest, but just to pay interest on old debt, you're in a Ponzi scheme. Spain did this for 150 years. The Ottomans did this for 30 years. Japan has been doing this for 35 years. The United States, we're doing it right now. Check. Stage 4. Interest payments become unsustainable. Math breaks. When debt service consumes 30 to 50% of revenue, the government can't function. Spain reached this in the 1590s. The Ottomans reached this in the 1870s. Japan avoided it by printing money to keep rates at 0. The United States, we just hit $1.1 trillion in annual interest payments. That's 15% of tax revenue. And interest rates are still relatively low. If rates go to historical averages, our interest payments would double to $2 trillion. That would consume 30% of revenue. We're entering stage 4 right now. Check. Stage 5, lenders lose confidence or government trapped. Spain faced this in the 1600s when lenders refused to lend. The Ottomans faced this in 1875 when they defaulted. Japan is trapped here now, can't raise rates without destroying budget. The United States, foreign creditors are slowly reducing dollar holdings. China has reduced U.S. Treasury holdings by $300 billion since 2021. The world is losing confidence. Slowly. But it's happening. We're in stage 5. Check. Stage 6. Default, hyperinflation, or lost decades. This is where it ends badly. Spain, 4 defaults and imperial decline. Ottomans, default, foreign control, dissolution. Japan, 35 years of stagnation and counting. The United States hasn't hit stage 6 yet, but the pattern says it's coming, because the math is impossible. Stage 7, economic collapse or permanent decline. Spain never recovered. The Ottomans ceased to exist. Japan is permanently diminished. When you hit stage 7, the empire is over. Maybe you still exist as a country, but the power, the prosperity, the future, gone. That's the pattern. 7 stages, 3 empires, all followed it exactly. And now the United States. Let's look at where we are right now. Stage 1 and 2 are long past. We started borrowing heavily in the 1980s under Reagan. Debt was $900 billion in 1980. We're now at $36 trillion. We borrowed for military expansion, for social programs, for tax cuts, for everything. Check. Stage 2. Growth slowed. Spending didn't. GDP growth averaged 4% in the 1960s, 3% in the 1980s, 1990s, 2% in the 2000s, 2010s, 1.5% in the 2020s. Growth is declining, but spending keeps increasing. We went from $2 trillion budgets to $6 trillion budgets in 20 years. Check. Stage 3. We're borrowing to pay previous debt. Of the $2 trillion we borrow annually, about $1.1 trillion goes straight to interest payments. We're in the Ponzi phase. Check. Stage 4. Interest payments unsustainable. $1.1 trillion in interest now. More than defense spending, more than Medicare. And rising. If interest rates return to the historical average of 5%, our interest payments would hit $2 trillion. That's 30% of revenue. Unsustainable. We're entering stage 4 right now. Stage 5, lenders losing confidence. China, Russia, and other nations are reducing dollar reserves, moving to gold, creating alternative payment systems. BRICS is developing a dollar alternative. The world is preparing for America to fail. We're in stage 5. This is where we are. The question is, how long until stage 6? Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. But the math says it's coming. Because here's the reality. We have $36 trillion in debt. We're adding $2 trillion per year. Interest rates are historically low, and we're already paying $1.1 trillion in interest. If rates rise to 5%, interest hits $2 trillion. If debt continues growing at current pace, we'll have $50 trillion in debt by 2030. At 5% interest, that's $2.5 trillion annually, just in interest, no principal repayment. Just interest. That would consume 40% of tax revenue. There's no fixing that with growth. We'd need 6 to 7% GDP growth sustained for decades. We haven't seen that since the 1960s. There's no fixing it with spending cuts. Social Security, Medicare, and interest alone exceed tax revenue by 2030. Everything else, defense, education, infrastructure, all borrowed. There's no fixing it politically. Both parties refuse to cut spending. Republicans won't cut defense or Social Security. Democrats won't cut social programs. No one will raise taxes enough to matter. The math is broken. The politics are impossible. And the pattern says stage 6 is inevitable. 3 empires followed the 7-stage debt-death spiral. Spain, Ottoman Empire, Japan. Each time they thought they were different. Spain thought the silver would save them. The Ottomans thought European powers would bail them out. Japan thought they could print forever without consequences. They were all wrong. The pattern won. And the United States thinks it's different. We have the reserve currency. We have the largest economy. We're America. But the pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot borrow more than you produce forever. You cannot have debt service exceed revenue. And you cannot escape the spiral once you're in stage 5. 3 empires proved it. And we're following their exact path. The only question is timing. How long until stage 6? How long until lenders refuse to buy treasury bonds? How long until the Federal Reserve has to print so much money that inflation explodes? How long until the math breaks completely? Maybe we have years. Maybe we're closer than